Hello and welcome to Clay Center Now. I'm Shannon Stark with Clay Center Area Chamber of Commerce, and I'm sitting down today with Dale Nims, a historian currently working with the Clay County Action Network and the Economic Development Group here in Clay County. And we are excited to sit down today and talk about Clay Center's downtown area becoming registered with the Historical Society. So he's going to be speaking on that today, and let's just jump right in. So how did this project kind of come about, and how did you start working with the Clay Center Action Network?
The project itself was initiated by the Action Network. They applied for a grant from the State Historic Preservation Office, which is part of the Kansas State Historical Society. When they received the grant, then they issued a request for proposals. They reviewed several proposals, and luckily I was selected as the consultant to do this particular project. And the project is a historic preservation survey of downtown Clay Center. There were about, we completed 98 inventories of individual buildings, so not quite 100 buildings in the downtown area. We surveyed those buildings, took photographs, located them on a map, so we created a map of the area with those buildings numbered and identified. And then we described them, did an architectural description that describes their historic architectural form, and then secondly, what alterations and changes have happened over the years. And in some cases, since some of the buildings date back to 1885 or so,
wow.
There have been quite a few changes, but they have a lot of their original character still. And then we also researched the history of first the downtown and Clay Center and Clay County, and then the individual buildings as well.
Very neat. So there's a lot of history then, going back to 1885, some of those buildings. So, I mean.
Well, and that's one of the things we did a final report. And it has what's called a context statement, which is, so there's about a 20-page history of Clay Center, going back to the founding of the county and then the town, and carrying it through the tornado of 1973, and commenting in a few paragraphs on the situation of the downtown now. And of course, originally, this downtown was built as a railroad downtown, and the railroads now are gone, and we have highways instead. And the highways are pulling businesses into other locations than the downtown. Fortunately, the Clay Center downtown is still a strong, active business center, but it has some challenges, like all small towns in Kansas. And one of the advantages of doing this survey and a possible nomination eventually is to bring attention to the downtown and help strengthen it.
Very neat. Good. So talking about what you've done this far, the Clay County Action Network actually came to you. You became a consultant with them, and they received a grant to fund the survey. And when you say survey, that is something that you put together, and the map and everything you just spoke on. That's the survey and the report. Right.
We pull together information, and then we find new information. So there are the two components of that kind of are looking at doing the photographs, which are a record of what's there right now. And then from that, we describe the buildings, what we think is historic material, what is more recent alterations. And there have been some changes, of course. One example, the old Bonham Opera House, which is on 5th Street. I was just working with that a little bit yesterday. And of course, as probably some people can remember, originally the Bonham Hotel, which was a 3-story brick, magnificent hotel building, stood on the corner where the bank is now. And the Opera House was part of that building complex, and that's the only part of it that remains. And after the hotel was torn down, the front of the Opera House building was substantially remodeled too. But that was done, we think, in about 1925. So now that's more than 50 years old, and so the 1925 version of the Opera House is a historic building too.
Even though it's not original, it's still
Exactly.
historical.
Yeah.
Very neat.
Right.
So after your survey and your report, this ended in July.
Yep.
And what were your findings from that? I mean, is this something that's possible, something that's needed in the downtown Clay Center area?
Well, yes, I think it's valuable. The basic part of the context statement, the history of the downtown, tells us, for example, or brings to light some things that people may not be aware of. One is that much of the downtown was really established beginning in the 1880s. And there are a number of buildings that survive from that period, and they've been altered since, but they're still there. So on Lincoln Street, on Fifth Street, several of those buildings date from the 1880s, and then there have been buildings that have been replaced, and new buildings have been built maybe from 1895 or 1910. There are these periods when the downtown developed. Another thing to keep in mind is that the downtown developed around the Courthouse Square, which is a specific type of town plan. That's actually called the Shelbyville Plan, and it comes from Shelbyville, Tennessee, which is one of the first examples. It was designed in 1810, and then that idea was brought with settlers further west to Kansas. And there's some other town plans that will show up in Kansas, but the Courthouse Square is very common around here.
Very neat.
So that's one thing. I mentioned the tornado. That was a factor. One of the things that goes on in the 1940s and 50s is buildings are, quote, modernized. So they get either new fronts or they get covers on them. The City Hall, for example, was built in 1937, but it has a later metal screen on it. And so we can see how the downtown developed. It was influenced by local conditions, by the regional economy, by what people thought was interesting.
Wanted and needed at the time.
And they wanted to be modern. Businesses always want to promote themselves as a modern, up-to-date business, and one of the ways they do that is to change their fronts of their buildings, especially. It's, as somebody who studies this, of course, I can walk around to the back of the building and I can see a stone wall back there that dates from the 1880s, even though the front may be different.
Very neat. Well, after this break, we'll have a quick break and we will learn more about what our next steps are and how this is all going to come about.
Count on our team at Eagle for reliable internet, TV, and phone, because keeping you connected is what we do. Eagle Communications, our community connected. Count on our team at Eagle for business class phone, internet, and technology solutions, because keeping your business connected is what we do. Eagle Communications, our community connected.
Welcome back to Clay Center Now. I'm Shannon Stark with Clay Center Area Chamber of Commerce, and I'm sitting down with Dale Nims, a historian, speaking on the downtown district here in Clay Center. He's been working with the Clay County Action Network through the Clay County Economic Development Group, working on getting our downtown area registered at the national level to be a historical place, a historical downtown. So we talked a little bit about why this all was happening and how it all came about. So let's talk a little bit about our next steps. Now that the survey's done and the report has finished, and you've had all of your findings, and we see that this is possible, what's next? What are we going to see next?
What I'm working on currently with the Economic Development Group is drafting, writing, compiling a National Register nomination for the Clay Center Downtown Historic District. Now, I drew the boundaries of that in collaboration with the State Historic Preservation Office. Not every building in the downtown will be included. It will be kind of the core buildings from, say, 6th Street over to 4th Street, from Court to Lincoln, which is where the historic buildings are concentrated. When we get out on the edges, the buildings there are some historic buildings, but they're scattered, and in some places they've been replaced and they're no longer historic buildings, they're more contemporary buildings. So the district boundaries are drafted now, and it will include about 72 buildings. Not all the buildings in the proposed district are contributing. When we do a historic district, though, we want a substantial majority of the buildings to be contributing. By contributing,
Is there a certain amount? I mean, does there have to be 50 buildings that are considered historical, or I mean, it's just a majority?
it should be at least 50% or so.
Yeah.
And higher is better, but somewhere between 50 and 70% is good.
And do you know where we are?
We're
where we stand?
above 60% at this
Okay.
point. When I say, and I want to explain the contributing and non-contributing, the contributing buildings, when we look at them, we can see their historic appearance. There may be changes. There always are with historic buildings. There are very few that survive completely unchanged. But the basic pattern of the storefront is there. There's ornamentation, historic ornamentation. So those buildings in their form is basically their historic form. There are buildings that are non-contributing. They could be buildings that are less than 50 years old that have been built since, that might be replacement buildings. We have a few of those. There are buildings, and I mentioned the City Hall, which most of it is still intact, but because it has the screen on the front, its historic appearance has been changed. So it, at the moment, is non-contributing. Maybe someday it could be contributing. So these things can change a little bit. And that applies to some other buildings in the downtown also. And there are some buildings that have just been dramatically altered, so we really can't see their historic appearance. The walls may be from a historic building, but the front is so changed that it's non-contributing. So that's how we distinguish those two categories. That becomes important later when we talk about what the benefits of a actual registered historic district would be. One thing I'd like to just throw this in here is this really isn't about me. I mean, I do my job, but the Clay Center, the people on the Clay Center Action Network have been really fine to work with. They've helped, and Laura Huber, who is the administrator, we had public meetings to explain what we were doing. They helped organize those. Jeff Gazer and the other staff members of the Clay County Historical Museum have been helpful. We had our meetings in their building. Jeff and his staff have shown me their historic documents and information, and I've asked Jeff lots of questions, and he's helped me answer some of them. So I've gotten really good cooperation and support from people in Clay Center, and I just want to acknowledge and appreciate that.
Yeah.
And we also worked with Katrina Ringler and Jamie Fiore from the State Historic Preservation Office. Oh, and Michelle Tessero, who's a local Clay Center resident, took most of the photographs. So I really appreciate the excellent photographs that she provided for the project. And I filled in with some of my own, but she did a lot of that photographic work.
Great.
So a lot of teamwork to make this project go.
It's been a community effort to get this going.
Yeah.
Very great. So what does the nomination, the next step of actually getting the nomination written
Well,
to the state?
the next step will be to present it to the State Historic, to Jamie Fiore, who's the National Register Coordinator. She'll comment on it, and my plan is to give her a draft on a week from today, and it's due by the end of October for her consideration. And then it would be, if it's accepted and approved by her, it goes to the Kansas Historic Sites Review Board, and their meeting is in early February of next year. There's quite a takes a while to give notice and
Yeah.
prepare for these meetings.
So the state will see it the end of October, and then
The review board will see it in February, and it will be approved or not then. Then it actually would, over the next 6 months, it would go to the National Register of Historic Places for their approval or not.
So if this goes through, we would be registered with the state and the
At that-
National
well,
Historical Society.
Right, in February it would be registered with the state, and then in another 6 months with the National Register.
Very neat. That would be great for our downtown district. And we will talk about the benefits of being a registered historical downtown district right after this break.
At Eagle Marketing Solutions, we believe your advertising should be as unique as your business. Because if it's important to you, it's important to us. Call Eagle today for your customized marketing plan.
Eagle Technology Solutions is the strategic advisor for your IT business needs. Because if it's important to you, it's important to us. Call today, Eagle Technology Solutions. Technology done right.
Welcome back to Clay Center Now. I'm Shannon Stark with Clay Center Area Chamber of Commerce, and I'm sitting down today with historian Dale Nibbs, and we're talking about getting Clay Center's downtown district actually registered at the state and national level with the Historical Society. So we've talked a lot about the survey and the report and the nomination that's getting submitted to the state, and now I'm very interested in this topic of what's the benefit of being a registered downtown district.
Yes, we basically talk about it in terms of 3 benefits. The first, listing on the National Register either for an individual property or for a district is an honor. It's basically honorary. And one of the products is this National Register nomination, which summarizes the history and the architecture and explains why this historic district is significant. So the areas of significance for the Clay Center district are pretty typical of towns throughout Kansas and the United States. Architecture, community development, and business, basically, or the economy. The downtown was the economic center of the town as a historic town. And it's, still is in many ways, although that's changed a little bit. So the architecture is very typical, the 1- and 2-story, occasionally a 3-story building on fairly narrow lots, so most of the buildings are rectangular. The multiple storefronts, one of the beauties of the Main Street pattern of storefronts is that a storefront can be 25 feet wide, it can be 55 feet wide. We see buildings start in one storefront, and then as they grow and prosper, they move into another storefront. Maybe they can even expand, further, but those multiples are very adaptable. And when a business wants to downsize, they can shrink back to one storefront. It really works well. And what's happened, we see this in the downtown, is different kinds of buildings can be in different buildings. And we might have a harness shop, and then when that doesn't do well, a garage can come in there, or maybe an insurance business. So these are very adaptable spaces. That's one of their strengths. The honor, the second is that there is some level of protection. People worry, well, what does this mean I can't change my building? And really the National Register doesn't limit anything a private property owner can do. If a private property owner dramatically changed their building, it might become non-contributing, as I explained earlier. If they tore the building down, then we would take it out of the district. It would no longer be part of the district. What we want to do, though, is encourage people to do what's appropriate, what enhances the historic architectural character. Repair the windows instead of replacing them. Keep as much of the original material as possible, things like the ghost signs.
Yeah, so you encourage them to preserve it, but it's not required.
Right, at least by the protection part. The National Register requires, when a federal action or federal money is involved, that would affect a historic building, there has to be a review process.
But that's only when there's funding involved.
Right. Now in Kansas, we do have a state historic preservation law, so an action that requires a permit would also require a review by the Preservation Office. They would only comment on it if it was a very significant action. So things like painting the building don't require a review, but major alterations of a building in a historic district requires a letter to the Preservation Office so they can say something like, well, we don't think this is a good idea, or we wish you wouldn't do this.
Or we recommend this
We recommend that you do
instead.
something else instead, so you can get them, and that's to get them involved in the process. But again,
And maybe something that they never considered or thought about.
Right.
If you give them recommendations, then they may.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. But it doesn't stop the action. I mean, the owner can still go ahead and do it if they choose to. The third, so there is the honor, there is the limited protection, and then third, there is the basic thing that is very helpful for, as an economic development activity, is there are federal and state tax credit programs for the rehabilitation of certified historic buildings, and if it is a contributing property in a district, then it's a certified historic building. When Congress, and the tax credits were brought about, there's a federal tax credit that's approximately 20% of the value of the rehabilitation. We have a state tax credit in Kansas that's 25%. So taking those together, a commercial property in the downtown could get, say they do $100,000 worth of rehabilitation work, they could get $45,000 in tax credits,
Wow.
which would reduce their costs quite a bit.
Yeah.
The work has to be reviewed
Right.
so that it's appropriate, so that it enhances the historic building rather than detracts from it. But usually that's just common sense.
Right.
But
And
that,
again, maybe a recommendation they didn't think of.
Right.
And they may like the choice better even.
well, and it could be cheaper and more energy efficient and better for the long-term value of the property. Because one of the things about remodeling these historic storefronts is what we thought was really interesting in 1970 doesn't look so up to date anymore.
Right.
Whereas the historic look is kind of timeless and doesn't really change. So sometimes it's a better value.
Yes. And very popular right now too as
Right.
well. I think
Right.
that historical look is coming back and,
Yeah.
and everyone respects it and enjoys it. So
Yeah, it represents stability,
Yeah.
Good value, integrity.
Very neat. Well, we will stay tuned and see what comes about all of this after the nomination and the review in February, and then the 6 months later with the National Historical Society. So thank you, Dale, for being here today. We appreciate it, and hopefully the community could learn a lot about downtown becoming a historical district. Thank you for joining us. I'm Shannon Stark with Clay Center Area Chamber of Commerce.